Chapter 11, The New Plagues. Where did you come from, baby dear? Out of the nowhere into here. Nursery rhyme. In the preceding chapters, the evidence for harmful biological effects from exposure to abnormal man-made electromagnetic fields was discussed from the point of view of laboratory and epidemiological data. This chapter will present the medical evidence relating these fields to recently occurring significant changes in the spectrum of human disease. We are currently facing diseases that were unknown just a few years ago. We are also seeing disturbing increases and alterations in certain diseases we believed we had conquered. While the AIDS epidemic commands the health lines, there are other illnesses of equal importance, such as Alzheimer's, cancer, and developmental defects that have not received the same amount of attention. The new scientific paradigm we have been considering may provide some clues to these new plagues, some informed speculation, and some indication of the directions we should take. The global environmental alteration brought about by our use of electromagnetic energy has exposed all living organisms, from viruses to humans, to novel energetic fields that never before existed. We've seen how these fields interact with sensing systems designed to perceive the normal electromagnetic environment, producing abnormal bioeffects that result in changes in the incidence of diseases. This interaction appears also to have been the origin of some new diseases states and of a number of unexpected changes in the characteristics of some pre-existing disease states. In theory, a disease that suddenly appears out of nowhere may be caused by a genetic change in a pre-existing microorganism, a bacterium or virus, that creates new pathological characteristics. Or it may be caused by a major decline in resistance to disease, making people susceptible to attack by microorganisms previously incapable of producing disease. In practice, things are not quite so simple. Hippocrates was correct in believing that the clinical characteristics of a disease are the result of the combined actions of both the disease-producing agent and the patient's body. When we're facing a new disease, it's often difficult to tell which is which. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity syndrome. When I first acquired some public notoriety as a researcher on biological effects of electromagnetic fields, I began receiving a trickle of letters from persons who insisted that they were highly allergic to such fields. Some said they were even moved to remote rural areas that are free of most electromagnetic fields. I must admit that for the first few years, I was highly skeptical of such claims and thought that the conditions must be purely psychological in origin. But during the past 5 years or 6 years, the trickle of letters has turned into a flood that I can no longer ignore. Fortunately, other medical scientists have become interested in this specific condition and involved in establishing its diagnosis. Dr. William Ray, a former surgeon from Texas, discovered his own sensitivity to electromagnetic fields while working in the modern operating room. As medicine became a technology, the operating room became a home to more and more electrical devices. Today, in my opinion, it could well be classified as a hazardous environment. By eliminating other sources, Dr. Ray determined that his allergic and neurological symptoms were caused by the electromagnetic fields in the operating room. He subsequently discovered that he was not alone in his hypersensitivity, and that there was a growing population of patients with the same condition. These people are typically told by their physicians that their symptoms are all in their minds and that they should seek psychiatric care. Ray became outraged about this situation, and he established a clinic to deal with this problem as a real entity, his Environmental Health Center in Dallas, Texas. It's probably the best equipped clinic of its kind in the country. The patients are tested through exposure to a spectrum of electromagnetic fields in such a fashion that they are unaware it's being done. In most patients, a consistent sensitivity to certain specific frequencies can be found and quantified through objective measures of the activity of the autonomic nervous system. In this way, Ray has proved that the electromagnetic hypersensitivity syndrome is a real clinical entity. People with this syndrome have a number of characteristics and symptoms in common. The following case history is typical. Mary M., not her real name, had worked for an international company for many years as a computer supervisor. She enjoyed her work and had no medical problems of note until she was asked to try out a different make of computer that the company was considering using. The machine seemed perfect. It was easy to use as well as fast and powerful, and she enjoyed working with it the first day. She went home that night with a minor headache, which subsided with an aspirin. Returning to work the next day, she used the new machine for less than an hour, and the headache returned. She took another aspirin and wondered whether she was coming down with something. As she continued to work with the new computer, she became nauseated and dizzy, and the headache did not go away. Mary then went to the dispensary where she was told that she had a slight fever and was no doubt coming down with the flu. She took 2 days off and she felt fine when she returned to work. But within minutes of turning on the computer, she experienced the return of nausea, dizziness, and a headache. A short time later, she began to experience severe fatigue, an inability to concentrate, and difficulty with her vision. As she continued to work, the symptoms became worse until finally she could not continue. She began to think that perhaps something was worse with the machine, and she mentioned this to the dispensary staff before going home again. When she reached her home, she noted that her face and the exposed portions of her neck and chest were noticeably reddened. This time, she took a full week of sick leave. On returning to work, she went straight to the dispensary so that the doctor could see that she was quite well before she used the new machine. She was told that in her absence, the manufacturer had checked her machine and found that it was operating normally and not producing a harmful field. As she opened the door to her area, she felt as though she had walked into a blast furnace. The whole room had been equipped with the new machines, and her staff was busily working with them. She stayed for only a few minutes, during which time she became extremely ill and had to leave. This time, the doctor asked if she were having any emotional or personal problems of any kind, and he suggested that if so, she see a professional about them. Mary refused to return to work, and she left for home. She then noticed that her TV and stereo produced the same symptoms in her if she was within a few feet of them. Over the next few weeks, her condition gradually worsened until even the telephone made her ill. She also developed what appeared to be the allergies to sunlight and smells of such things as laundry, bleach, and perfumes, all of which made her feel nauseous and dizzy. The skin rash reappeared, and Mary consulted a dermatologist who told her that the electromagnetic radiation from the computer was the culprit and that he had seen similar cases. He recommended that she go away for a few weeks to some very rural area and see whether she recovered. His other patients had sometimes been able to return to work after such a respite from electromagnetic fields. Mary took his advice and she did get better. However, when she returned to the city, her symptoms returned. She never returned to her old job, and she now lives in a very rural area of a foreign country where she is fine. One final note on this case is that the computers are no longer in use by the company, which refuses to discuss the situation. Almost all the patients who have consulted me for this condition experience a similar abrupt onset of symptoms. Computers were not always the common factor, but exposure to a novel electromagnetic field of some kind was always the inciting cause. These people experienced the same symptoms and became sensitive to many common devices that had never been produced and any symptoms in them. For example, TVs, computers, stereos, fluorescent lights, telephones, electric heaters, high voltage power lines, electronic security systems. Within the past year, automobiles have joined this list of devices that can produce the initial sensitizing field exposure. These are always the new computerized models, and the patients find that they are quite able to drive the identical make and model if it is not computerized. As with any medical condition, there is a range of severity. With repeated exposure, some patients develop severe neurological responses with such symptoms as confusion, depression, decreased memory, sleep disturbances, and even convulsions or grossly abnormal behavior. Others never progress beyond mild symptoms when exposed to the original novel field. In general, there is little that can be done for any of these patients. Beyond advertising them to move to a location where the fields do not produce the symptoms in them. At present, the mechanisms causing a hypersensitivity to novel electromagnetic fields are unknown. However, it would appear that there is a direct effect upon the nervous system and that the immune system is very likely also involved. The incidence of this syndrome is increasing. Whether this increase is due to the rising number of new devices emitting novel fields, to the overall increase in field intensity from all sources, or to a change in the sensitivity of the human population, is as yet undetermined. Chronic fatigue syndrome. Fatigue may be produced by a variety of conditions, ranging from physical exertion to relatively minor virus infections, to serious infectious diseases and cancer. In 1982, a new syndrome was reported that was at first thought to be either chronic mononucleosis or chronic Epstein-Barr virus infection. It was characterized by severe fatigue, sore throat, tender lymph nodes, mild fever, and inability to concentrate, depression, and mental confusion. Since then, professional interest has increased, along with reports of a rapidly increasing number of cases. Some investigators believe that this condition is not a new disease, but it is simply a fad produced by publicity. Attempts to track down the causative agent have revealed only that it is not mononucleosis or Epstein-Barr virus. In its most severe form, this condition is prolonged, often lasting for years and severely debilitating. In some patients, the major symptoms are neurological with severe disturbances verging on psychotic. Recently, the Centers for Disease Control declared the condition to be a real clinical entity and proposed formal criteria for its diagnosis. However, no treatment, including the antiviral drug aciclovir, has been found to be effective. In one aciclovir study done at the National Institutes of Health, matched groups of cases were given either aciclovir or a placebo. Results were identical. However, the investigators, headed by Dr. Stephen E. Strauss of the Medical Virology section, found an interesting association between the results of psychological tests and the changes in patient symptoms. Significant improvement was seen in levels of anger, depression, and other mood states correlated with overall clinical improvement. In other words, if the patients believed they were getting better, they actually became clinically better. The hypersensitivity syndrome and the chronic fatigue syndrome share a number of common characteristics. Both are newly described conditions. Both begin rather abruptly with a flu-like condition, and many of the symptoms, particularly those associated with the central nervous system, are identical. The major differences is in the reported sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. However, some patients who were diagnosed as having primarily chronic fatigue syndrome have consulted me because they definitely felt worse when exposed to TVs and other devices, even though they did not consider this to be a major aspect of their illness. Some patients with chronic fatigue syndrome feel improved when they are in rural areas away from sources of electromagnetic fields. Finally, the chronic fatigue syndrome has been found to be widespread in the electronics industry. particularly in Silicon Valley and Northern California. According to James Cohn, Chief of Occupational Medicine at San Francisco General Hospital, these are not people with typical allergies, but people who appear to have some kind of neurological or immune system problem. More than 100 Silicon Valley employees have filed lawsuits against their companies for the condition. While by no means proven, the possibility remains that both conditions share the same basic causative factor, exposure to abnormal electromagnetic fields. The differences in the syndromes are that in one type there is an overt hypersensitivity to the fields, while in the other this factor is either lacking or is much less evident. Both, however, share the general characteristics of involvement of the central nervous system and the immune system. If the present trend continues and the percentage of the population developing either of these conditions increases, it could become a public health problem of some magnitude. AIDS. It now appears quite clear that the causal agent of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, is a new virus called the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. However, there is no question that other factors such as general resistance to disease, behavior, and lifestyle also play a role in the actual disease syndrome. AIDS came out of nowhere, and it is not all clear what its antecedents were. In 1980, Time magazine reviewed the new disease and the role of the Centers for Disease Control in combating them. At that time, the mystery ailments were limited to Legionnaire's disease and toxic shock syndrome. 2 years later, AIDS appeared. Although its cause was then unknown, its virulence and mortality rate indicated that it was a public health problem of great importance. This, of course, has been revealed by its subsequent spread and our failure to control it. The HIV virus shares some attributes with a number of other viruses that cause various leukemias in human beings and animals, but its clinical characteristics are dominated by its attack on the immune system, particularly in the T cell lymphocytes. Dr. Julie Overbaugh and her colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health have worked with a cat leukemia virus that is capable of producing either leukemia or an acute immunodeficiency syndrome similar to human AIDS. Using molecular cloning techniques, they were able to produce a mutation of the virus that produced rapidly fatal immunodeficiency syndrome in young cats. They concluded a subtle mutation change would convert a minimally pathogenic virus into one that would induce an acute form of immunodeficiency. It would appear possible that the present HIV virus is the result of such a mutation of a pre-existing virus that was originally non-pathogenic or minimally pathogenic to people, because abnormal electromagnetic fields have been shown to be able to cause genetic mutations. Perhaps this mechanism was involved in the mutation of a non-pathogenic virus into the HIV virus. While this may seem at first to be far-fetched, it is not beyond the bounds of possibility. It would be quite unusual if clinical AIDS disease was simply the result of infection with the HIV virus. Regardless of the state of the human host, it is likely that other factors, such as the status of the immune system, increase the chance that an infected person will develop the overt clinical syndrome. Therefore, the depressant effect on the immune system of chronic exposure to abnormal fields may also be involved. In a recent paper, Daniel B. Weil of the Jerry L. Pettis Memorial Veterans Hospital in Loma Linda, California, reported that exposure of human T cell lymphocytes in culture to a low strength 60 Hz electric field for 48 hours significantly reduced their cytotoxic ability against foreign cells. Weil's report is the first to think such fields directly with the cells of immune system. This finding raises the question of a relationship between the depressant effect of power frequency fields on T cell function and the susceptibility of these cells to infection with the HIV virus. The orthodox physicians in charge of the response to the AIDS epidemic are locked into the chemical mechanistic model, which involves the idea of a magic bullet that would kill the AIDS virus. The truth is that we have no chemical agent that is effective against any viral disease, let alone one so sophisticated and genetically changeable as HIV. The possibility that an effective antiviral chemical or vaccine will soon be developed appears remote. It is time to stop thinking about AIDS as being simply the result of infection with the HIV virus and to begin to consider the possibility that these electromagnetic factors or similar ones might play a predisposing or causal role in total syndrome. We also need to begin an organized study of those techniques of energy medicine that are known to enhance the operations of the immune system. Considering the fact that there is no known curative or life prolonging treatment available for AIDS, I see no ethical consideration that would preclude the use and evaluation of these techniques. Fragile X syndrome. One of the chromosomes identified in the human cells is the X chromosome, so named because of its shape. The X is one of the sex chromosomes along with the Y chromosome. The male-female gender decision in each individual is determined by the ratio of X and Y chromosomes in the fertilized egg. 20 years ago, a syndrome characterized by various degrees of mental retardation, behavioral disturbances, and certain anatomical characteristics was found to be related to an abnormality in the X chromosome. X chromosomes of these patients show an apparent separation of a fragment of one of the limbs of the X, hence the term Fragile X syndrome. It appears that the defect occurs during early mitosis of the fertilized egg and is caused by a failure of the chromatin, the aggregated DNA that becomes the separate chromosomes, to glue together properly at this site. It is now recognized that Fragile X is second only to Down syndrome's as most common genetic defect in this country. The incidence of Down syndrome is about 1 case per 1,000 births, while the Fragile X occurs 1 per 1,000 and 1 per 1,500 births. Strangely, not all persons with Fragile X chromosomes have the syndrome, and there is some evidence that the condition is passed from mother to son. Research is progressing in unraveling the complexities of this important condition, and the most recent finding is of great interest. Immediately following the report of the Dr. Korshins on the defect in the cerebellums of autistic children, Dr. Alan Rice of Kennedy Institute at Johns Hopkins University examined the brains of patients with the Fragile X syndrome. He found a very similar defect in the cerebellums of these patients. Cancer. I had already indicated that the overall rate of cancer in the United States is steadily increasing, despite improvements in diagnosis and treatment and declines in the rates of some of the more common types of malignancies. Part of the explanation is that this overall rise in incidence is derived from much greater increases in incidence of cancers of tissues in which there is a high rate of cellular multiplication. And that group is a particularly interesting cancer, melanoma of the skin. In a recent article, Dr. Mark H. Green and his colleagues at the National Cancer Institute wrote, "The incidence of cutaneous malignant melanoma is rising rapidly through the world. The most recent data from the National Cancer Institute surveillance epidemiology system revealed that an 80% increase in the incidence of melanoma in the United States between 1973 and 1980. Dr. Thomas B. Fitzpatrick of the Harvard Medical School has likened the increase to an epidemic, and he has stated further that this type of cancer is not only the fastest growing of all cancers, but is also affecting a younger age group each year. Because it is known that overexposure to sunlight is one of the causes of melanoma, there has been much recent speculation as to the possible link between its increased incidence and the decline in atmospheric ozone. This seems unlikely, however, because the increased rate of melanoma predates the decline in ozone, and because the ozone holes are limited to the Arctic regions, with no measurable decline found in the ozone layer over the United States. A clue as to possible causative factor for this disturbing trend may be found in the one place in this country that has the highest incidence of melanoma, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory at Livermore, California. The laboratory is deeply involved in the design and testing of new and exotic weapons. In 1977, the Cancer Epidemiology Branch of the California Department of Health Services began a study of what appeared to be an excess of malignant melanoma on the skin among LLNL employees. The results of the study revealed a 3 to 4-fold excess of such cases over what would be expected. The excess was limited to LLNL personnel and was not duplicated in the surrounding civilian communities, which were then experienced the slower nationwide rate of increase in the incidence of this type of tumor. In other words, the personnel of LLNL were experiencing a much higher incidence of melanoma on top of the general increase in the rest of the country. In 1985, doctors Peggy Reynolds and Donald Austin, the directors of the study, reported the results. They noted that while melanoma at LLNL was elevated above normal, so were the rates for tumors of the salivary gland, colon, and brain. However, the rates of incidence for these other tumors were not too dissimilar from those in the surrounding communities. Only malignant melanoma stood out as special to the laboratory. Reynolds and Austin emphasized that the laboratory personnel showed no excess of the types of tumors that would have been expected if ionizing radiation, X-ray, nuclear radiation, and so on had been the causative factor. Therefore, something else in the laboratory environment had to be the cause for the gross excess of melanoma, but they had been unable to find that something else. While no data were available on the exposure of the laboratory personnel to non-ionizing electromagnetic fields, the nature of the work being done indicates that such exposure might have been high. For example, when I was consulted by the laboratory on the possible hazards of personal exposure to DC magnetic fields, I learned that in some individuals were routinely exposed to DC magnetic fields as high as 1,400 Gauss for the entire workday, and that the safety standards were set at 2,000 Gauss for the body's trunk and 20,000 Gauss for the extremities. These are truly high strength fields, and we have no prior experience with the effects of prolonged exposures to them. In view of this inadequate database, the origin of the safety standards is highly questionable. The situation regarding DC magnetic fields may represent the exposure situation to electromagnetic fields in general at the laboratory. In view of the stimulatory effects of abnormal electromagnetic fields on cancer cells and their ability to alter the genetic apparatus of dividing cells, this peak of the epidemic of melanoma at the Livermore laboratory becomes most interesting. It would seem prudent to assess the actual field exposure of the laboratory personnel and to conduct a prospective epidemiological survey. Unfortunately, the classified nature of the work done at the laboratory precludes such an investigation. Mental diseases. In 1980, the National Institutes of Mental Health began a long-range study of the incidence of mental disease in this country. In October of 1984, Dr. Daryl Reiger of NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, announced at a press conference that early results indicated that about 20% of the total US population had mental disorders severe enough to require psychiatric treatment. More significantly, people under the age of 45 had a rate of mental disorders that was twice as long as the rate for those over 45. This alarming trend indicates that the incidence of mental disease is rising markedly. The increase is not in true psychosis, such as schizophrenia and manic depressive states, but in neuroses, such as depression, phobias, antisocial personality traits, alcoholism, drug addiction, and suicide. The increase in adolescent suicide rates is particularly disturbing. In 1986 editorial, the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Leon Eisenberg of the Harvard Medical School wrote that between 1950 and 77, the suicide rates for 15 to 19-year-olds rose precipitously, fourfold in males and almost twofold in females. Furthermore, He wrote, a suicide rate higher during adolescence for any cohort, group of persons born during any 5-year span of time, and for previous cohort predicts that the rate will be persistently higher for that cohort as it ages. The message of the first quote is self-evident. The second means that for any group displaying a higher suicide rate, the rate will remain higher for the rest of the life of that group. Eisenberg concludes, clearly adolescent suicide is a major health problem for the long term, as well as for the short term, and the search for factors that influence its frequency take an added urgency. Over the past 3 or 4 decades, some environmental factor has been introduced that has seriously influenced the basic levels of mental functioning, perhaps in the entire population. The fact that the effect is seen almost overtly in younger age groups seems to indicate the factor is operating during the early stages of life. There does seem to be a direct link between suicide, depression, and functions of the pineal gland. At a 1986 conference on suicidal behavior that was sponsored by the New York Academy of Sciences, Dr. Marie Asperg of Sweden's Karolinska Institute presented data indicating that a group of depressed patients with a deficiency in serotonin had significantly higher rates than a similar group of depressed patients whose serotonin levels were normal. It seems that there may be two types of clinical depression, one that is produced by simple psychosocial factors and one that is produced by some external factor that influences the production of these psychoactive chemicals by the pineal gland. In view of the known relationship between the pineal gland and magnetic fields, it is advisable that the search for the responsible factor include an evaluation of the effect of abnormal electromagnetic fields, particularly in the early years of life. Where do we go from here? While some of the preceding discussions is speculative, it is informed speculation based upon a wealth of currently available data that indicate a plausible link between abnormal man-made electromagnetic fields and these changes in the spectrum of diseases. Taking together with the data contained in Chapter 8, these new diseases and the disturbing changes in pre-existing diseases constitute a major health problem for their nation. The medical profession needs to begin to deal with them in a more effective manner. There is a need for a change in the basic philosophy of medicine in its handling of these challenges, because we are dealing with the effects of electromagnetic energy on the energetic systems of the body. The new scientific paradigm that lays support to the basic concepts of energy medicine provides a good place to start. Two pathways should be followed. First, epidemiological studies must be expanded to include the possible causative effects of environmental electromagnetic fields. Second, the therapeutic possibilities of utilizing the body's own energetic systems to treat these new conditions, either alone or supported by appropriately designed and applied external fields, must be simultaneously explored. The growing tendency to integrate the concepts of energy medicine with those of orthodox medicine must be encouraged. If those who are totally committed to the orthodox chemical mechanistic paradigm are solely in charge, much valuable time will be lost. To illustrate this point, the National Cancer Institute recently announced that it will begin a full-scale study of the possible relationship between exposure to power frequency fields and childhood cancer rates. While this sounds appropriately responsible and even hopeful, the problem is that many of the top level scientists at NCI have over the past 2 years testified in legal proceedings that power frequency electromagnetic fields have no biological effects and that exposure to them is absolutely harmless. It would appear highly unlikely that an unbiased study could be conducted under these circumstances. While the AIDS epidemic is often referred to as a medical crisis from the point of view of the growing number of victims and the mounting costs of care, I believe that this is far too narrow a perspective. At a time when cancers of many types are increasing in incidence and virulence, the number of children born with developmental defects is increasing. 50% of the population below the age of 45 have serious mental problems. Major neurological degenerative diseases are found in both the very young and the very old with increasing frequency, and we have no effective treatments for any of these conditions. AIDS may be seen as simply the tip of the iceberg of much a greater problem. What will be the effect upon our institutions and culture if these trends continue to increase in extent? Clearly, we are facing a crisis of major proportions, one that is all more critical because it has not been recognized as such by the agencies responsible for dealing with it. The public must play a major role in resolving this problem. Without a public that is educated as to the real extent of the crisis and that demands effective action of its officials, nothing will be done until the situation becomes so critical that remedial actions may be impossible. In addition to the environmental situation, people also have the responsibilities for their own personal health and safety. None of these responsibilities can be delegated to others.